Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the world of Elan. And in today's little edition, we're going to be talking about the books. So, hopefully, all of you who are now watching me have read absolutely everything that I've ever written, so that if I do talk about something, you're not going to find a spoiler. Good. I was kind of looking to see if the chat's going to pop up to make sure that I'm actually not just talking to myself. So thank you, Michelle. As we go forward here and I start talking about books and start answering questions, one of the things I'm going to be doing in order to make sure that we don't ruin the story for some people is I'm going to be holding up one of these. And I'll do that before I start saying bad things, and hopefully you can turn off your mic if you're afraid that I might spoil it for you. And then afterwards, you can look for this sign, and you can turn your mic back on, or your speakers back on, I should say. Hopefully this will make it so that no one gets in big trouble. And I can talk more freely to those people who have read the whole masterwork, I guess, of everything I've done. Also, if you're going to be asking me questions, try not to do it in the chat area. The chat's really for you people to talk to each other. And you can make fun of me on there and make jokes at my expense, because I'll be trying to watch the question tab. So if you want to ask a question, click on the question tab and put it there. I happen to notice that by looking at it, there is at least 2 questions, and one has been voted to the top by at least 3 people. So I will begin there. Joshua says, do you already have approximate release dates in mind for books 5 and 6 of Legends of the First Empire? Okay. No, to be quite honest, I don't. Most of this is going to be handled by my wife. She's the one who, once I get done with the book, she handles the editing process. She handles the publishing in general, so that I can continue writing, which is wonderful that she does that. But what she's going to be doing is, let me back up and explain. So the next 3 books in the Age book series of the Legends of the First Empire, the next 3 books of those is going to be Age of Legend, followed by Age of Death, followed by Age of Empire with a Y. So those books are going to be a little different from everything else I've written, in a sense that usually when I write a series, I try to write the series in such a way that each book is kind of a complete story in and of itself, and you could stop reading with that book, and you wouldn't feel that you're at a complete loss. And I tried to do it that way so that people could jump into a series at pretty much any place they wanted to, and they wouldn't be left out. There wouldn't be things that they wouldn't understand, because I would give you sort of a recap, not in a literal recap, but I would just kind of feed you back information so that you would have enough information to understand what's going on. But these last 3 books, however, it's not going to work the same way. They're literally one long story, and it's going to be presented in much the same tradition as, say, The Lord of the Rings, or maybe Patrick Rothfuss's Name of the Wind series, or Raymond Feist's The Magician, which was actually divided into 2 halves, because when he first wrote it, the original book was just way too large for the publisher to take the risk on publishing that. I have the same problem. My story is way too big, so I'm dividing it into 3 parts. And as a result of that, because it doesn't have that nice complete clarity. Now I'm not like ending in the middle of a sentence, nothing like that. I did try the best I could to make a complete round story there. But that said, you're still not going to be happy waiting too long for that next book. And since they're already done, we should be able to move up that schedule. So you shouldn't be waiting a year for these books. What instead is going to happen is Robin, as soon as she gets done putting out Legend, she's going to get right to work on Age of Death, and she's going to try and treat the last 2 books like one book. So she's going to edit the 2 books through. She's going to press both of those through the beta readers, and she's already has time reserved with Tim Gerard Reynolds to do the audio back to back, so that both of those books will hopefully get done in a very timely manner. It doesn't mean that they're going to come right out together, because there's a lot of other stuff she does. In fact, we've been working on Age of Legend now for a very long time. I finished that book years ago. And then I went through and did edits based off of her comments. And then we did more edits based off her comments. And after all that's been done, Robin has now been working on that since January. And it's not like she's loafing off. She's working every single day on it. There's a lot of stuff she has to do. She's working through betas. She's working through, artwork. She's working through layouts. And she has 2 different editors working on this. And she's, of course, editing it herself. So all rolled in. And she's also doing additional things, such as right now she's trying to make the list of all the Kickstarter backers whose names will be going in the print version and ebook version of the book. So all of that needs to be assembled. And so there's a lot that goes into it. So best guess, to answer your question, best guess is going to be that I would expect Age of Death to probably be coming out maybe this fall or early winter. I can't tell you for certain on that, though. Don't beat me up if I don't hit that mark. And then hopefully Age of Empire will follow very soon afterwards. And I'm just going to jump over to chat here just to make sure that no one's got any complaints. It started, no problem, game on, cool. Everyone can hear me, right? You got that whole answer, and just type anything. Just let me know you're hearing me here. Come on, there we go. Yes, cool, okay. Again, for those of you who didn't hop in here at the first moment, you may have come in late. I'll just reiterate what I had told everyone else, which is that today we're talking about the books. So if you have any questions about anything I've read, and even if you haven't read me, it's okay, because we're going to use a spoiler alert card here to alert you to the fact that you need to turn off your mic if you haven't read what we're talking about. And I'll hold up another one to let you know that you can turn it back on. Also, if you're going to write questions, put them in the question tab. Don't put them in chat, because I'm not looking at that window through most of it. Okay, so let's get back to the question. William says, are there things you would want to go in and add to the Rhaenyra Revelations because of the world building you have gotten to do in Elan and Age of Legend, the First Empire? Okay, and Rhaenyra Chronicles. Do you now have a better sense of religion, Rabus, Kyle, and Uberlin now? Okay. Now I'm going to give a very long answer to this question. So anyone else who's out there listening, you have your time to ask me another question because we're running a little down. But let me have a drink first. Mouth is running dry. Okay, so it's interesting that in this question is the idea that would I like to have put something in the earlier books so that it would, I guess, have better continuity or something I'd leverage later on? The reality is it's just the opposite. If something is not in the story, if something is not in my world, then it can be in my world or it cannot be in my world. It's up to me to decide at the time I need to do it. But if something is in the world and I literally can't change that. I mean, I can bend it to some degree in the sense that if I state something happened in the world or something is a certain way in the world, then and it runs contrary to what I want to do, then I have to think to myself, what's the source? Who said that? I have a phone call. This is very odd. Hold on just a sec.
Call from Sullivan Robin.
Interesting. Hold on just a moment.
Call from Sullivan Robin.
Hello. I'm right in the middle of my podcast. Okay, bye. Hello again. That was my wife. And the only reason I took this is because she knows I'm doing this. So I thought it must have been really important, but she had completely forgotten I was doing this today. Okay. So sorry for that commercial break. But getting back to what I was saying is that if I put something in the book, I can't change it. But if it's not in the book, I can. If I put something in the book, I have to figure out who the source is for that comment. Because maybe they didn't know, or maybe they lied. But if it's someone who is has definitive knowledge on that subject, or someone who, I can't explain away. Here's a good example. I was writing Winter's Daughter. And in that book, Hadrian meets a character. I'm going to keep the spoiler free. he meets a character, and it was going to be this interesting story. I had it all plotted out and all laid out. But then I happened to be looking back through the Ra'yer revelations. And in the process of doing that, I noticed that it literally says, Hadrian never met this person in his entire life. No wiggle room at all, because Hadrian would know if he met this person, and there's just no way I could hide it. So I had to then alter my expected plot for that book in order to accommodate for this. So that was a huge problem. So in that sense, that's an issue. So in the past, and right now, what I'm finding is I'm actually in a series ahead of the Legend of the First Empire series. So what I'm discovering is that I'm creating things and locking things into place in the new series. I'm now going back and making last minute changes to the age books, to the remaining 3 age books, and making sure that they line up. And this is kind of a problem, because the last 3 books of Legends of the First Empire are going to codify and kind of hard code a lot of things in my world. Because what I'm doing is in these last 3 books, I'm kind of going back to the very origin story of the world. And I'm going to be explaining how everything, or how a lot of things actually work. And once I put those in place, it's going to be very hard for me to create stories around these things without using. Now, it's good because I'll have a functioning system at that point that's now been revealed, and the reader will understand why certain things happen. But as I start to implement these things in the age books, I'm seeing how they're going to affect later books. So it's great that I'm doing this, that I'm already ahead in the series, so that I can make sure these 2 things work together. Now, the age, or the books I'm working on right now, which for now we'll call the bridge books, those books are now are making the connection between the age books and the Ra'yer books. So they're very complicated. I had to bring all these different loose ends together to meet. But it's used to be I would never publish a book series until I had them all done, so that if I had to go back and make a change so that the story makes sense, I could do that. Now it's getting to the point where I actually have to finish several series in order to make sure that the entire scope of the world works out. It's getting complicated, but hopefully this last series I'm doing now will be the last major piece of the puzzle that gets laid in place, and then you'll see how the whole story comes out. So, long story short, the idea is that it isn't so much a matter of I wish I put stuff in, it's a matter of I wish I didn't put stuff in. Robin always has a tendency to tell me to back off on things like dates or specific times or ages, because that locks me in, and I have less wiggle room if I want to adjust something later on. So as a result of that, it's what I've actually locked in that becomes more of a problem than what I have. Jumping back over to chat here, honestly, the fact that you don't just written things when it's convenient makes way more satisfying to me as a reader. I'm having trouble understanding the word retcon. You don't just retcon things. Okay. No rum tonight? No, I'm not allowed to drink. If I do that, I get bad, and I end up telling you all the spoilers, so we don't want to do that. Oh yes, I don't go back and change things. I try not to, at least. Like, in fact, that one situation I had with Adrian, Robin literally said, well, it's okay, no one's going to really notice that. No one will actually, because it's a very small, it's literally like 2 sentences. And she's like, no one's going to notice that. And I'm like, I know it's there. So I couldn't do it. And that caused me to actually completely rewrite the story, which it worked out okay. So a lot of the times when I'm writing things, the mistakes I made actually help, because as we know, not everything that happened in the past of Ra'yer actually is true. Or what people in the modern day in Ra'yer time understands is not actually true. And the reasoning is that, time has changed it. But had I known from the very beginning the entire story, I might have literally given you that story, and it wouldn't have had the depth or dimension that it should have had, because I came across the idea that time would erode truth and time would erode details. When I realized that, when I wrote Writer Revelations, I knew that the actual history wasn't the real history. But I didn't know a lot of other things, and by adding those greater details, it does make it seem much more realistic. So to some degree, it's actually a good thing I didn't know. Questions? No? We're short on questions, people. This is going to be a long show. We need to have some more people. Come on, there must be something you want to know. I mean, certainly you wanted to know how, let's say, how Royce managed to survive all those years as a child. Will I ever actually write about those early years of Royce, or Hadrian for that matter? What about who is Ulrich? Have you wondered about that one? What's behind the door? These are all things that you could ask me. I won't answer them, but you could ask me. Someone is actually putting something in. Great. Are Malcolm and Nimbus the same person? Well, they couldn't possibly be the same person. Okay, so if you've read my books and you know, and there's things in my books that some people wouldn't know because they haven't read them, I will hold up a spoiler card. But if you ask me a question that's a spoiler for everyone, one way or another, I'm not going to be able to answer that one, because no one would know the answer to such a question as that. And I wouldn't trust anything I say in my books. So I can't tell you that one. Does anyone got something a little bit easier for me to answer? Now, you would think, of course, that by my not answering that I'm saying yes, but it's not necessarily true, because I would give the same answer regardless. New Chronicle book. And I like how you put in the word any new questions or any new information about the Chronicle book. Probably not, but I'll give you some information that maybe you don't know. The whole thing with that was I'm in the process of, like I said, I'm writing a trilogy now. I'm in the middle of the middle book. So I've written one of them. I'm in the middle of the second book. And Robin wanted me to obviously continue with Chronicles. And one night I was actually listing them out. And it turns out there's not 12 books, there would be 10 books, because they've been together 12 years as of the second year they were together. So there would be 10 Chronicles. And I was listing out exactly when things would happen at what time, based off of all the things that I had said over the years in Raira of their past experiences. And it's surprising that I put in enough hard evidence that each of the events, if you were to analyze them, you find that they actually have to fall in specific years. So the next one I discovered by looking at it would be Drumendor, which is the story of how they climbed the big the Dwarven fortress, as is mentioned in Emerald Storm. I literally just wrote that down as being the potential title of the next book, because the fact it would have to have something to do with that. But my wife, of course, saw that and immediately posted it out there on Goodreads as a potential, next Chronicle. I didn't even know she did it. So unfortunately, yes, that would be the next one I'll be putting out, but that probably would not be written until after I've written these 3 books I'm in the middle of. And because, of course, the ones that I'm writing right now are under contract, Drumendor is just a figment of imagination. Only thing I've done with that is think of some ideas. And as with all things, I wouldn't want to just tell you the same story that I told you in Raira. There would have to be something new coming to it. So a lot of that story probably would be prior to the actual job. So there would be more information that would be interesting. And I would try to give you more aspects of the world that you haven't seen before, more characters you haven't seen before, and it would all come to conclusion much the long way that I explained in the first book. But the bulk of that book would probably be more than just Drumendor. But yes, that would be the one coming out. And unfortunately, if I were to do the math, we have 3 books coming out. And then you have 3 more books coming out. And so we're talking several years away for another Rhaenyra book, unless, of course, my wife, like, breaks my legs and puts me in a bed and forces me to write. I should never let her read Stephen King. What do we got here? How did reading Revelations now read first books of age? Magic. How did magic become so taboo? Okay. Of course, this might be answered by the next book. How did magic become so taboo? Well, actually, you could probably work it out. If at this point in the story, you could probably look at certain dynamics and realize why that would be. I'm not going to actually give you the answer to this one because, like I said, it's a puzzle that you should be able to work out. You will get the answer, of course. You'll get the answer to just about everything. I've had people ask me, how is it that the elves go from being so important to being less important in the time of Revelations, and that will be explained. And why is it that magic became taboo? That will also be explained. But you really should be able to reason that one out because it's really just sort of a logic problem at this stage. I mean, there's certain people who are going to be in position of power, and certain people who like magic, and certain people who don't magic. So you're going to figure out how that's going to work out. And it should be that difficult to come up with. Could you tell us what the next story after Jumandor be if it would end up being a chronicle? I probably could, but I have to look at my notes. It's been a long time since I've studied that. Actually, I actually think I do know what the next one's going to be. The next story, it could be entitled Blythen Castle, which if you've read Winter's Daughter, you'll know that there's a part in it in which Royce says, he never wants to come back to this place. And it turns out, of course, if you've read Revelations, you'll know that they'll be coming back at some point because they have to, because I've already mentioned it and I've pointed that out. And that book is an extremely important book. And if you read Revelations, you should know exactly why that is probably would be the most important chronicle I write, because that has a number of elements in that would be very delicate. And my biggest problem is when I write the prequels, I want to write them in such a way that they don't spoil Revelation. So if you want to read Chronicles first and read through all the way to the end, you should be able to do that without spoiling too much. Now, right now, everyone understands that I suggest that you read the books in publication order, starting with Revelations, then maybe the Chronicles, and then the Age books, and probably then the Bridge books. But I'm fully knowledgeable, and I totally believe that once I'm done with this entire construction that I'm putting together, in the future, people will read my books probably in chronological order, starting with the Age books and working their way through to the Bridge books, and then the prequels, and then Revelations. And I want to make sure that it does work that way. So as a result, I'm trying to make sure I don't spoil anything. And Blythen Castle would be a ridiculously hard book to be spoiler-free on. In order to be honest and not hide anything from the reader, sort of speak, or fudge things so that, I'm lying, it will be very difficult and delicate to make that work. But I've got a really good idea. I've already mentioned it to Robin, and we've concluded that's actually should be a fairly genius idea of how I can go about telling that story without actually spoiling anything. So, so it would probably, after Jumandor, would be Blythen Castle. And hopefully that will not be a bad book. Because to me, every book that there's a lot written about it in Revelation means it's probably going to be less interesting to the reader because of the fact that you know a lot already. So I'm not giving you anything new. Whereas like something like Dulgap, you didn't know anything in that story. And you didn't know much of anything in Winter's Daughter. So I felt that those would be more fun to read because they're completely new and original. And it's not a matter of just getting a rehash of what you had before. So hopefully it'll still work out. Let's see. Is there magic other than the art on a lawn? For example, the goblins seem to have some sort of magic. Is it the art? Okay, so a lot is made right now about magic systems in fantasy. This, I think, and I could be completely wrong, but I think this predominantly became a thing because of Brandon Sanderson, who went to great lengths to build a magic system. I'm sure he's not the first one, but I mean, his became very pronounced. And after that, a lot of people have tried to do a variation or an idea of that sort. I have a totally different take, well, not a totally different take, but I have a different take on magic. And the idea I have is that I don't like magic systems because if you explain too much about how magic works, it stops being magic and starts being science to a degree. If I touch a wall and the room is illuminated, it looks like magic, but if I explain to you there's a switch in electricity, then it's not quite so. It's still pretty amazing and it's very hard to understand, but it's not quite as magical as it could be. So when I write about magic in my world, there's a reason why I call it the art, because I actually base it on art and the concept that if you'll notice, most of the people who use magic, I reference a lot of it being creative, and it's like the creative process. So it's more the way that people look at this source of power that they can use. It's magic, but how they perceive it and how they manipulate it, they perceive as creativity, and therefore they call it the art. Now, does that mean if someone else is able to manipulate the world in ways that people don't understand, and if those people call it a different name, is that something different or is it the same thing? Oberdazis and the goblins, they use magic. Is it a different kind of magic? Well, every individual magic user in my world does things a little bit differently. It just as in the real world, it's two artists will do two different things. So it's like saying, is someone painting, is their art different from someone else's? I mean, you could say, well, yeah, one's Impressionism and one is Cubism and one is Realism. Is it really different art, or is it just another form of creativity that takes on the personality or the interest or the skill of the person doing it? So obviously your question is not as easy to answer as you might have thought. But if you're asking if they're all tapping the same source, yes. Because in the world that I have, you'll find out, magic is essentially the world of Elan and like the concept of creation and how everything is strung together, and all those things can be manipulated because they were manipulated originally to create something. Therefore, you're just going back into the basic structure, almost like software. If you have a program, if you were running let's say a computer game or a simulated world, if you can get into the code and rewrite it, then that would be the art in a sense. But if I were to explain it to you in that kind of detail, it would stop being magic. It would start being coding. So we wouldn't do it that way. So I try to keep that sort of childish wonder that you would have when you have no idea how it really works. And even the people who do it don't have a clear understanding of it. They get a sense of it. They get a sense of how they can do it, but it's still not something that they fully understand, because if they did, to me, it would stop being magic. I'm going to jump over to chat and see what people are saying over there. There is some people talking. Good. How did... I've not read... Okay, that's the same one. So she copied and pasted her question. That's wonderful, I think. Will we ever see Hadrian or Royce solo? Or will their backstories all be inferred from your books? Okay. One of the weird things I have, so obviously I mentioned my feeling about magic systems. So this is another thing. I've always found it really odd how, since Tolkien, almost, well, not almost every, but I mean a large majority of fantasy books include sometimes the birth, but most often the youth and coming of age of the main character or main characters in a story. I would be hard pressed to come up with some that don't. I mean, maybe you could say Game of Thrones doesn't go the way, but a lot of the people there are young and grow up over the course of the story. But I mean, you either begin with them as a child or you start with them as an adult and you have flashbacks to their childhood. You see how they became who they are. And I actually don't know of any other genre that does that. It seems to be a quirk very particular to fantasy, and it's really predominant in fantasy. I would say that there's probably more childhood explanations of how they grew up than there are dragons or magic in the average book. But I've never liked that because I never understood what was wrong with starting with the adults and just running from there. I mean, most other ones do. You never find out about Sam Spade or Sherlock Holmes' background. You never saw their youth or their childhood. I mean, no one ever had a problem with it. So in my mind, if you start with an adult, you can draw from their childhood. They can make comments about it, and it gives a sense of depth. Because what I wanted to do when I created the stories was I wanted to make you feel as if you met these people. And if you met the people, you wouldn't have some sort of weird mind meld where you would go back and see their entire youth and see how they grew up. But they might mention some things over time. And from those comments, you could infer certain, maybe this is how they got to be who they are. Maybe you're completely wrong. Maybe what they said is a lie. Maybe they said something that means a lot more than they meant to say. You don't know. So in that respect, I preferred not to give you that backstory. Also, in addition, I don't really think that the readers would enjoy finding out about Royce's backstory or Hadrian's backstory for that matter. Those years, Royce and Hadrian were not who they are today. Obviously, Royce went through a very unpleasant time. And if I were to write his youth story, what you would get would be something I don't generally like, which is grimdark. I don't like writing stories about bad people doing bad things and bad things happen. That's not something I enjoy. Hadrian, oddly enough, would pretty much be in the same boat. He would be a generally good person who kind of gets into a bad way and makes a lot of wrong decisions. So both of those stories would be pretty awful from a kind of heroic fantasy story sense, which is what I like to do. I don't want to give you, I don't want to write grimdark. I don't want to write a miserable story. That's not something I enjoy doing. And I don't think that the majority of my readers would prefer that either. What I can do is by putting these two people together, they balance each other out. So you can have a lot of darkness with Royce, but you also have it balanced out with Hadrian. And together, you can get a sense of one kind of hero in two different parts, rather than the separate awfulness of how they grew up. I just don't really feel that that would be particularly good. But you'll get more information about their background. In fact, oddly enough, you'll get some of the information about their background in the Age of Legends series, because there are some interesting hints that are going to lead you to understand how certain things happened in the very beginning of Ryu Revelations. But that's still a ways off. That's not going to come until probably the end of Age of Empire. So that's kind of a little, hint or prod to get you to continue reading Age of Empire or Legends of the First Empire. I know they were both unhappy. Agreed. Thanks for answering. I agree with you. Oh, good. Well, that's good, because I would assume that there'd be a lot of people out going, no, we want you to write grimdark because that's what's really popular. But it's just never been my cup of tea. I tend to like it when people read. I've always liked it, that the idea that when you read one of my stories, when you're done reading it, you actually feel better about yourself and the world in general than you did when you started reading it. And if I can do that, I'll be very happy, because I just would prefer to make that kind of story than one where when you get done, you're like, I feel like crap now. And I don't want to do that. Unless, of course, you're one of those people who takes a great deal of pleasure in other people's pain. Never mind. Would it be interesting to you to write a set of stories that happen in the world you've created, but feature a different area of the world with different characters and conflicts, featuring dwarves and elves independent of Hadrian and Royce? Okay. Actually, it's kind of funny you mentioned it, because a long time ago, and I'm talking about several years ago, I was sleeping, and my wife woke me up for some reason, and I couldn't get back to sleep. And I thought of a story. And I sat down in the middle of the night, and I literally wrote an entire book. Now, I didn't write the book, but I wrote an outline for it. Usually that doesn't happen. Usually I come up with an idea, and I have some ideas here and there, and I keep working on it, and I keep adding stuff. And then when I have enough, I start writing it. But literally this time I outlined it completely. It was the most complete outline I ever had, and I did it in one night. And what it was it was a contemporary story set in the modern day world. And it had a really interesting sort of, I don't know how to explain it, but what I realized was I can't write that book. And I took it to people who knew about the subject matter, and they said, no, you cannot write that book. That would be very bad. But what I realized is if I wrote it in allegory, then I probably could. So I can give the same message, but not mention any of the names or dates or places. So what I ended up doing was I conceived of a Rayura story, not Rayura, but in Elan, contemporary in time to Royce and Hadrian. And actually it would feature the goblins, or the gazelle, the Balrog gazelle would actually feature as one of the major characters. And then it would also have a great to do with the dwarves, and to a much lesser degree humans. So you would be in a different part of the world that you had never been before, and you would totally see it from a completely different direction. You'd actually be seeing a lot of it from the goblin version, or their point of view, the goblin and dwarf point of view. And that would have been a very fascinating story to write. And just to make it really fun, I would have comments in there about distant rumors and distant stories that are coming out of New Persepolis. And so you would get a little bit of additional stuff that happens, say, after Raya Revelations. But I just have not ever had the time to write that story. Sadly enough, it's sitting in a drawer, outlined, ready to go, but I have so many other things I need to get taken care of right now that I just have not got to it. But maybe when I run it, I would write that, but I have to write another chronicle for those who want, the Drumendor books. I have a lot backed up. I'm only one guy. And I write really quickly. I mean, I'm writing, right now, I'm probably at a pace of about 2 books a year, which is more than they're being released at. So I've actually got several backed up. But even that said, there's still a lot that I have to think about. And I don't know if I'll be able to get around to all of them eventually because I have so many different ideas I would like to pursue. Let's see. Is there other magic? Oh, we already saw that one. I'm sure it's been asked before. What authors have you read recently that you appreciate? Okay. I hate the fact that I cannot remember. Maybe someone out there knows. I started reading a book called Circe, and I cannot remember the author's name, which is driving me crazy. I've actually been listening to it. If I had the book and I had a cover, I could see the name and I would remember it more accurately. But so Circe it's been on the New York Times now for at least the Washington Post, because that's the paper I get. It's been on there for like 20 weeks so far. And I've spoken to other people who have read the book, other authors, and they said, yes, it's great. You should read it. So I finally started reading that about a few days ago, and I'm about 60% of the way through the book. And it is very good. For me, I thought it started off a little weak just because it didn't seem to catch its groove in the beginning. But once she gets to the island, then the story picks up really well, and it's been very good. The writing is excellent, and so I would say many good things about that book. Other authors that I would let's see. Let me think of other authors that I've enjoyed recently. But oddly enough, I tend to read a lot of nonfiction, and Bill Bryson is one of my favorite authors in that area. I just got done. For those of you who probably read my blog, you'll know that I do a lot with birding. So I've actually been reading birding books. I read The Big Year, and I just got done reading The Genius of Birds. But I mean, For other authors, if you're looking for other authors that write fantasy that I enjoy, I generally don't have a lot of those to mention because I don't really read a lot of fantasy for the most part. I have a tendency to read fantasy more obligatory because people say, would you read this for me and give me your feedback. So I do read it, but it's not a matter of recreational. So most of the things that I've been reading have been, well, like Ernst Cline was good, and Fault in Our Stars, can't quite remember his name. I'm terrible. I hope people remember my name more than I remember their name because I'm terrible at that. I was telling someone recently that they were wondering how I keep my books and all the information in my books. You know, do I have a notebook, or do I have some sort of, you know, little cue cards that I use in order to keep track of all the details? And I'm like, no, I can remember stories. Stories are things I can remember. I can't remember names, but I can remember stories. So, I mean, I could read a book years ago or see a movie years ago, and I can tell you all the plot, but I can't tell you who was in it. I can probably not tell you who the names of the characters were, but I can tell you the story. So I'm trying to think. There's got to have been, I mean, obviously The Martian, Andy Weir, I loved that one. That was a fun one. Fault in Our Stars, like I said, I picked that one up. And it's not the kind of book that I would expect to like. I mean, the premise of the book was pretty awful. But I picked it up and read the first few pages and was like, wow, this is really well written. So, of course, I wanted to read that one. And like I said, Ernst Cline, Ready Player One, that was a fun one to read. Oh, I also got done reading Nicholas Imes, or Mays, I'm not sure about his last name. Kings of the Wild. That was a fun book to read. I mean, a lot of the things I'm reading is actually like old classics, which I never read for whatever reason. I was watching the 100 Best Books of All Time kind of thing, where they were, like, it was on the PBS or something was doing this over last summer. And so I actually kind of wrote down some of the books I had never read before. One of them was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which is a fantastic book, which I never read. So I'm also trying to pick up some of those as well, just because there's often these great jewels that exist that for some reason I never found. And when I find them, they're really good. So I have to scroll up occasionally. We have visited Calais, Delgos, Yerevan, and Aberlin. Will be ever going to Westerlands or Dhaka? Potentially in Age of Death. No, actually, you won't be. You kind of almost got to Dhaka in Emerald Storm, but you didn't quite get there. But you got a taste of it. But no, I didn't have anything set there. And the Westerlands, really, the Westerlands was just that portion of the world that's not drawn in. I suppose if technology advances in the world of Rhaegar, which it would, at some point they would travel on and they would circumvent the globe and they would find all these places. But right now it is just known as the unknown. The Northern Wastes and the Westerlands are just where people haven't gone to before. And they haven't, it's like deepest, darkest other continent, and they just don't go there. Calais is the wildest place that they've been to, and they still, they never quite tamed it, even in the Age of the Empires. But now, so that's still thing. But they've never actually crossed in too much into the Westlands, because initially it's mostly desert. So you'd have to cross that before you get to anything. So there's a natural barrier, so nothing comes out and they don't go in. It's funny because the very first story I ever wrote that would have been set in a primordial Elan version actually took place in the Westerlands, and the characters who were like primordial Royce and Hadrians crossed through the desert looking for, at that time, what would have been Persepolis, because that's where it was originally had been placed. But when I was writing Revelations, I found that having it not be there was a great deal more advantageous, and having it being literally kind of under their feet would work out so much better for the plot. Rather than having it be in this completely different, distant land where other elements would not be able to get to them. So I have no plans for Westlands. It's just, like I said, the edges of the map. And there'd be no reason for him to go there in the past. Maybe in the future that would be the source of some book once the problems with the general Appellador in place is essentially kind of cleaned up and civilized, and we don't need more problems. Then you would push on into the frontier. But no, I don't have any plans to do that just yet. Madeline Miller, thank you there. Did you look that up or did you know? Madeline Miller would be the author of Circe. Okay, I'm going to jump over to chat again, see who's there and what's going on. Okay, so scroll. Circe, Madeline, yes, okay, you brought it up over there, but you noticed I wasn't actually looking at chat. Thank you. I appreciate your help. And yes, John Green. And now the reason I was hesitant to mention his name, because I always say the wrong name there. Yes, John Green. He also wrote Turtles All the Way Down. That's correct. I have not read anything else by him. It was just the first book I read. But he is a really good writer, and I did like his stuff. I asked the question about how you keep track of characters. Oh, it wasn't. I didn't know that you were actually here. Yeah, well, good. So you're here, and I just reiterated. So that was kind of a rerun for you. For some reason, I cannot hear anything. Anyone know why? They were having problems with mute at one time, but sometimes people had their speakers on mute. When my video launches, the volume. Okay, so these are just talking to each other. I couldn't hear anything in Chrome, but in Safari it's okay. That's really bizarre. I'm on a Mac, and every time I try to launch Kickstarter for one of these, it tells me I have to use Chrome. And yet, here you are using Safari and it's working. Okay, so unless we have some more questions, which I'm very happy to answer. Okay, so this person's just got it working. And I'm running out of questions to answer. So Joshua, putting you right on the spot. Do you have a question for me? Something that's been bothering you for a very long time. Is there anything in any of the books I've written so far that is something you'd like to ask? It's interesting because The Fault in Our Stars by John Green is about, part of it is that the characters in it are in love with the story that a writer wrote many, many years ago, and they didn't know if it was ever going to be a sequel or anything else about it. And there was unfinished questions at the end of the book, so they actually wanted to ask him the questions. But as it turned out, he was something of a recluse, and he was living in Amsterdam. So I actually went there to ask him. So you don't actually have to come here. You can actually just ask me now. Joshua does have a question. What inspired you to write the Legends of the First Empire series in the past of the world instead of writing something after Revelations? Okay, that's a very good question. So, and I'm sure some of you may have already heard the answer to it, but I'll reiterate. So when I finished writing Revelations, I was very happy with how I finished. I was ecstatic when I got done writing it. Even though it hadn't been published and it wasn't going to be published, I thought that I had written a really fantastic ending because I was very happy with how I had remembered and tied in every little plot point, every character answered what happened to them, showed how they all folded in together and had these sort of old seeds that I had planted all blossoming at the very end. And it came together in an extremely neat, well tied up package. And when I got done with that, I was very pleased with that ending. And I felt that anyone reading the book would also be very pleased with that ending and would not need to know anything else that came afterwards. To me, that was sort of like, the end of The Lord of the Rings, where, people are going across the sea and like, there is nothing else that you can do. It's the end of the story. And everything is perfect. So I did not want to add on. Also, when I wrote that series, I wrote it intentionally so that the first book would be the weakest, and then each book in succession got better. It got better in the way that the plot expanded, but also the stakes kept getting higher, and the way they got out of those problems became more dramatic. And so when you get to the final book, I mean, it is a huge story. We're talking epic fantasy at this point, and everything's at stake. and everyone is throwing everything but the kitchen sink, and you finally get to see how every single character I've talked to you about, you get to see them in their final glory. Everyone is doing exactly what I've always told you they could do, but you never got to see. And so as a result of that, I felt there was really no way to add on. If I added another story on to Raya Revelations, it would diminish it, because there's no way at this point that I could have made a bigger story with bigger effects, bigger problems, bigger stakes, and bigger solutions. I hit the end of that. So there was no way I could add on to it and make it better. Anything that wasn't bigger and better than the end of the last book would be seen as somehow disappointing. So not wanting to do that, I didn't go there. But my wife really liked Royce and Hadrian. In fact, she used to claim that it wasn't fair, because at any time I want to, I can just go visiting with Royce and Hadrian in my head, and she can't. So she was quite upset. So she wanted me to write something else. Well, being that I did not start with my main characters as children, being that, in fact, I didn't start even when they first met, I started with, they had known each other for 12 years, I knew I had like 10 years in which there were stories that could be done. Answers to questions that could have popped up, how they got from first meeting to where you see them in Raya. So I thought, well, I could farm those and put out stories for that purpose. And so I ended up going in and writing those in the Chronicles. But when I wrote originally, literally the idea of the Raya Revelations, I sent it off to a friend of mine. And I said, so this is what happened. And I'm talking about the entire history of the world, not just the Royce and Hadrian stuff, but the whole complete story. And I explained to him how it came to be. And we're talking about Nephron and Persephone and all that. And he literally he didn't look at me because it was writing me email, but he wrote back and he said, that is the sappiest, stupid thing I've ever heard. And I realized he was right, because that's exactly the type of story that you would read about in, say, like King Arthur's tales or ancient legends, that this is how it happened. But the reality of how it would really happen would be a completely different matter. So even before I began Revelations, I rewrote in my own head how that would really happen, plus what would be the fable that would be the basis of the modern world. So in doing that, I had sort of this sense that I had lied to the reader. So when you get done with Revelations, I realized everyone is going to think that the whole story about the gods is exactly how I explained it to you, when in fact it had nothing to do with that. Also, when I told you about the history of Nephron, that you would think that that's how it all happened. But then again, that's not what happened. So I really felt I wanted to come clean and tell you the real story. So that's when I felt that I needed to go back and give you this back history. It also helped that it was in the same world, and most people who liked Raya would probably also like that. But it was separate, completely different characters, completely different world scene, because it's set in a totally different time, totally different technology centers. There's no money. They don't even know how to ride horses at the time. So totally different setting, different characters, great. But I had to tell you the real history. So now that you have that, that's why I had to present that for you, in order to give you a greater sense of, how the world changed and how things came from being this to that, and then that got twisted, and that's now what you have at the end. It gives, I think, the whole world a great deal more depth. It's like the world becomes a character, and you find out that the history I told you about that character is not true, and you find out he's actually a much deeper person than you ever thought. So, or in this case, it's a she, because we're talking about Alan. All right. What else we got here? Oh, I'm glad you love the Chronicles. It's not done yet. Hopefully, you'll still like it. I'd like to see the next generation of Hadrian and Raya's possible children. Okay. Okay, well, that is something that I had played with at one time. I mean, it's fun to think of Mercy and Allie as characters in a story, because of the fact of who they are and what they would be capable of. And there'd be a lot of fun, because readers who had read Revelations would be in on the joke. I mean, if I started with a character who is a new character, and then they were to come across these people, and there could be a lot of different people I could draw, because I did have several young people that existed in the Revelations that I could draw into the story. And it would be just fascinating to see what these people became and how they became that way. And not to mention, it just would be, they're almost become superheroes in a sense like that. They'd almost be like Marvel superheroes if you run into Mercy, who is, has these certain abilities. And I'm trying to make sure I don't spoil too much. And the other characters would be, really interesting to see how I would reveal them in future stories. So, yeah, I mean, it's a possibility that I could probably do something along those lines, but I don't know. It would be difficult. It still wouldn't be Royce and Hadrian. It would be someone else. So maybe it just would be fun. Maybe a short story at the very least, just to kind of explore that idea. What else we got here? Yes, I have thought about doing things where Royce and Hadrian are legends. I remember reading, of course, C.S. Lewis's books, the Narnia Chronicles, and it was interesting because so much time passed in between visits, and you got to see how the legends, played out, and how the events of whatever they did made things great for a while, and then they slid back down, and then there was problems, and then they had to come back and kind of fix things again. And it would be kind of interesting to see how the world evolved, and if we can extrapolate from what happened with Persephone and Nephron and extrapolate that into the future, then if we went, in the future beyond Royce and Hadrian, what would people think of Royce and Hadrian? In fact, would they know anything about Royce and Hadrian? Because they weren't, any necessarily major kings or queens or anything like that. So, I mean, maybe they wouldn't know anything about them, or maybe they would be legends. And it would just be interesting to kind of try to explore that. And for a reader to be able to look back in time and having known them intimately through Writer Revelations to hear how they're remembered could be very bittersweet or very upsetting or very fun, and depending on how I handled it. One of the things I used to like was when I read Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. In fact, if you read all of his stuff, I'm pretty sure almost everything he's ever written is all in one coherent world at specific times. You start with like I, Robot, which starts kind of in present day and moves forward, and then you get all the way to the end of the series. It goes many thousands of years in the future to where they even forgot Earth exists, and they're trying to find it again. And it's just fascinating because how things develop, and it kind of comes back around full circle. And something like that would be fun to do. But again, haven't quite got that far yet. There is a possibility that when I first constructed the Rhaenyra concept, I did have a much larger story arc. And if it could be that the entire series with Legends of the First Empire, and with the Bridge books, and with the Chronicles, and with Writer Revelations, they actually would outline one big story that would be about certain characters that you don't actually know much about at this time, certain people who are moving around the world. And that could give me the complete story arc of the entire world. So there could be a story well after Writer Revelations to complete that story arc. It will be a long time coming because I couldn't tell you that story until I give you all the foundation that you would need in order for it to make sense. So that's kind of another reason why I'm doing Age of Legends as well as a bridge book, because these are giving you the necessary understanding that you would have to have for the last book or last series, perhaps, to make sense. And I am not certain that I would actually write that book, because I said that would be quite a ways in the future. And it's hard for me to actually think that I would be able to write that far or be able to do that much. But if I did, there is a possibility that I could do that. So yes, that is a possibility. And I mean, all things being equal, I would love to do it. Let's see. I'm glad you did, because Legends of the First Empire is great. Well, thank you. I'm glad you like Legends of the First Empire. Let's see. Am I allowed multiple questions? By the way, of course you're allowed multiple questions. If a TV series were to be developed, would you prefer for it to feature Legends of the First Empire or jump to Revelations? Well, actually, at the present time, there is possibilities of both. There is someone who's working on both of these things, on both Legends and Revelations, and they're both working on movie and TV. But I warn you not to get at all excited because the odds of this actually happening are extremely slim. The reality is that I think the idea would be maybe to have the age stories, the Legends of the First Empire, be movies, whereas Revelations would be a television series. Which is interesting because that's kind of how I originally wrote it. I actually thought of Revelations as being sort of a television series with each kind of like book being an episode, and then you had a story arc over the whole series. So kind of neat that they would think of it that way. But I mean, this has been in the works for a long time now, and not a lot's been happening, so I wouldn't get my hopes up. I mean, I don't want to have something produced that would be bad or that would upset people who have read the books. I also wouldn't want them to make something out of my books that I didn't like. So it would be something I try to resist. So as it is, nothing's happening so far on that front. But yes, we are trying to do that. So this is the best I can tell you at this moment. All right, so I'm going to jump back over to questions. See if there has been a few. Wonderful. Okay, did you notice a bump in readership when something happens like theft of swords being featured on Sword and Laser podcast right now? My wife is the one who tends to monitor the sales, and she does monitor them very, very much. And she has an enormous database of every bit of numbers she has. But I do not have access to that. Also, she's busy right now, which is why she's not even here. So as a result of that, if anyone's sending me email right now or Robin, and you're not getting a response, that's because we have some personal family issues that are kind of making things crappy for us. So bear with us on that. We'll get back to you as soon as we have the chance. But the result is that I couldn't tell you. It probably couldn't hurt, so I'm assuming that there could be some kind of bump on that. I don't know why it wouldn't be. And it's great that I guess I was somehow voted in on that. I actually found out about it on Twitter. Although I did recently get an email from one of them explaining that they were doing it. But I originally just found out on Twitter that somehow there was some sort of like March Madness election that happened there. It's interesting because the only other time I think I won an award really for any of my books was years ago for Avon Partha, when it was, I think, a Reader's Choice Award thing. And it was up against huge names. And at the time, I was just a self-published author, and Avon Partha was the only book I had out. And it actually won. And I was totally shocked because I've never won anything. So it was fascinating that actually was picked up. And again, so this was a surprise. I had no idea that I was even in the running. So it was great. And I will have to obviously tune in and see how that turns out. So hopefully you won't say any bad things. It's funny because I remember there was a writers group that invited an author to actually sit in when they made their comments, and apparently they all hated it. It was like he didn't want to actually tell anyone that he was the author, so he kind of was like him and hawed. Oh, that book is awful too. I totally agree. So there's sort of a danger, and they didn't actually do that anymore until they had people read it and see if they liked it before they invited the author to actually sit in. So maybe I should stay out of it. I don't know. We'll find out. Do you notice? Okay, so we will find out, will we find out if Trylos, the Tetlin Witch, or other mystery characters are by the end of Legends, or will we have to wait for the bridge books? No, you will not. You will find out an enormous amount of information by the end of the Legend series. That's kind of the point. There are some things that you will not learn. But those things have much more to do with questions that take place between the establishment of the empire and Revelations, not so much having to do with major, massive Gothic, H.P. Lovecraft style questions. Those will be answered. And it's funny because they weren't going to be. When I first wrote the series, it was going to end with Age of War, because I felt that having read Revelations, you know how the end comes, and it'd be like, what's the point of telling you how the rest of the war goes? But I realized that some people might start with Age, and they would have a real problem if I didn't tell them what happened at the end of the war. So, I was going to just leave it there. And I was going to leave the whole mystery of the door and Trylos and all that was going to not be answered, because I was going to actually save that, as I was saying, for the end of this long story arc. So I would have something to kind of reveal. But as I realized I had to extend the books, I had to come up with something new that would be kind of a reveal at the end of the series in order to make the entire story arc of these 6 books have a cohesiveness and have a point. So yeah, those are going to be things that will now be revealed in this book. I found a way that I could actually have that be revealed here and have that actually not be an end, but rather a stepping stone into the future. So yes, you'll find that bit of information out. All that stuff will eventually be told to you, and you'll be very happy. I hope at least you'll be told, and you won't be left on a cliff edge wondering what the heck, why didn't I answer this question? Which, granted, now I think about it, would have been a pretty stupid way of doing it, but sometimes I think of things late, but that's one of the reasons why I write the books very long in advance, so I have time to change these things before they go out. Have you thought about writing stories in a different fantasy world at some point, or are you committed to writing stories set in Elan? If I was going to write stories not set in Elan, I would set them in contemporary time. Elan is a perfectly good fantasy world. There's nothing that I should change about it. I've already done all the heavy lifting labor, so I can make wonderful stories in there, and I don't have to explain too much to you. One of the reasons why, in fact, Elan is not more unique, it's simply common. Most people would say it's full of tropes, and it is. And the intention was to make it so that when readers read the story, I don't have to explain to them things like what's a castle, or what's a king, or what's a knight, or a sword, and those kind of things. These were not things I had to explain you a whole new language on, because there's so many things in that world that are hard enough to explain in order to give you a full background, that I don't want to have to explain you simple things. So by not making it totally alien, you didn't have that problem. But I don't really see any reason why I would do another world, unless I guess the disconnect comes from the fact that, to me, world building is pretty much irrelevant. I don't really care all that much about world building. World building is a setting. It's what the backdrop is. My focus is always on the character first, the story second, and then whatever is necessary in the world building to support those two is what I put in. If the setting doesn't support the characters or the story, then I have no use for it. And in fact, if the setting distracts from that, then I will eliminate it. Because to me, world building is just a little icing on the cake. It's a little color in the background. It's not necessary to plot. You can have 2 characters on a stage, have a great dialogue and create a great story, and actually have nothing behind them but a corkboard. And it would still work great. But if you put a really fantastic setting and no characters, it's not going to be a very good show. So the whole point of this is that I don't really put a lot of effort into world building. So where I set my stories is somewhat irrelevant. Now, I put it in Elan because I needed someplace. I needed someplace that wasn't contemporary Earth, so that I could have a leeway to make things be the way I want them to be in order to make my story function the way I need it to. That's usually what world building is for me. The world building is there to set the obstacles for the characters. They're the things that allow me to funnel ideas in certain ways to make the characters and stories become interesting. But other than that, it really has no point. So I would have no reason to build another fictional world because of the fact that it's already got one. And I really don't care so much about the world as the stories. Now, I would be, now it depends on how you look at it. Now, if I were to write a futuristic science fiction stories, as I did with Hollow World, it's on Earth and it takes place into the future. So the future is my creation. So in a way, that is a fictional fantasy world. So yeah, in that case, I've already done it, but it's not a invented world fantasy. It is a look at the future of this world, which would be fiction and fantasy in a sense, but it's not actually an invented fantasy world as in the concept of, say, Lord of the Rings or something like that. The reason why I would want to write in a contemporary world as opposed to make any other world or even continue too many more books into Elan would be the fact that when I write in fantasy, I am very limited in what I can do. I do not have the ability to use free association or common knowledge. I can't make simple references like, it was like as cold as an ice cream cone, because those don't exist. So when I wrote Hollow World, when I wrote the beginning of Hollow World, which is taking place in the real world, or even later on, because the main character is from contemporary Earth, I was able to make fun references that people, I feel, would be much more readily able to understand. And for me, it gave me another, huge number of words I could use. My vocabulary was able to expand to an enormous degree because I could make references and logical connections that readers should be able to recognize with far less effort than I have to go through when I'm writing fantasy. So writing in a world that is contemporary is a lot of fun for me because I get to do things I don't normally get to do. So I would like to try other genres this Hollow World was a lot of fun, and some people have said they would like to see a sequel to that. And I've always wanted to see if I could do another sequel to that book. But there was many other books. I have science fiction books, I have horror books, I have just contemporary literary fiction type novels that I would like to try. All kinds of things I would love to write. If I live long enough, maybe we'll get there. People have been busy while I've been talking. Do you have any plans to revisit Hollow World? Well, funny, I already answered that question, sort of. When I wrote Hollow World, I had written it with the intention of it being, there being a second book at least. But originally it was going to conclude it in a certain fashion. The hive mind portion of it, if you've read the book, that portion was going to be settled. But when I got to the end of Hollow World, I didn't go that way necessarily. So when I go on to, if I were to do a second book, I could leverage that and make that kind of the subject of the next book, in addition to obviously other aspects that would be popping up there. I don't know if I can do a trilogy, but certainly I might be able to do a second book on that to give you the clarity that I couldn't quite complete with the first book, because where I ended it really kind of had to be where I ended it. The other ending it was kind of trailing off and it wasn't doing a good job. So where I ended it was good for Hollow World. And it stands alone completely fine. But I thought there was one part there I kind of wanted to explore a little bit more and explain why it was I was going in that direction. So yeah, I would like to do that. Again, like I said, I have so many other things. Like I said, I have people who are willing to give me money to write books of a certain type. I mean, it's not surprising. And as it is, that actually doesn't make as much difference to me as the idea of completing this story. I wanted to, when I wrote Revelations, that was just, I couldn't believe I had written 6 books. I mean, that was nuts. But then I wanted to write the origin story to explain how that whole thing took place. But then when I had completed those 2 elements, I realized there's a big gap in the middle. So I have to put that in. And now, obviously, there is this concept of maybe I should have a concluding chapter to it. But when I get done with that, there's probably not a lot more I would want to be going on, except maybe finishing out the Rhaenyra Chronicles. And then I would like to try some new things. So Hollow World might actually get hit. I mean, I might do the Goblin book. There's other things I could do. I have tons of people always write to me and says, I have an idea for a story. Would you like to write this? I'm like, you have no idea how many I have sitting on a shelf right now of ideas I need to dig into. Based on your answer to my other question, do you think readers in general prefer the world to be more familiar rather than reading things explained to them? Let me read that again. Do you think readers in general prefer the world to be more familiar rather than needed? Okay, I think you're saying that do I think that it's better to have a familiar world than an unfamiliar world? Some people really like being introduced to a completely alien place and making them feel that they are transported to someplace else. And there's a lot of books that do that. I'm not one of them. Not only do I want them to feel as if they understand the world and is familiar, but I also try to make it seem like it's a place that they are already living. And that's why when I write my books, I don't write in a formal sort of archaic language. I write in contemporary American for the most part. I don't go to the extreme of using dude or something like that, but I do try to keep it in enough vernacular that people reading it now would be able to, get the jokes, they would get the tempo, they would get the cadence of the voices, and you wouldn't have to go through the if you bring said sword, I will then smite him. That is what I wanted to avoid. I feel that just gets to be so haughty and so stiff that it doesn't resemble anything that ever would have existed. In many cases, I think that what most or a great many fantasy writers who attempt to do that are trying to hit on what they think life back then was in a medieval period. And in reality, I doubt they're even getting close to it. Because if you actually were to try and write in that time period, you'd realize that most of the words you're using aren't even there. Most of them didn't even get invented until Shakespearean times and then post that. So I don't try to be authentic because that's not my intent. My intent is to try and transport the reader into that time period so that they feel that they could be living there. They feel comfortable there. They can look around as if they're actually in a place that is familiar. And that allows me to do a lot of other things that I wouldn't be able to do. So I think that my readers prefer that because otherwise they wouldn't be reading me. They would be reading someone else who has a more militant concept of what a history should be in a very unusual place that is transportive, and they feel that they're in a completely different place. They have to figure everything out. And there are many people who love that, and I'm not knocking that at all. I'm just saying that for my books and what I want to do, it's totally different. In the ebook of Age of Legends, is the ebook still on track for next week for backers? Yeah, I guess. I mean, Robin is still trying to finish out the print book. And like I said, one of the things she's doing is she's adding the backers' names to the books and things of that nature. But like I said, we have a little bump in the road right now. It turns out my mother is not feeling very well. And so we're kind of juggling things to see what happens there. So we're kind of distracted at this moment. And so I hope you would understand that it's possible it could be delayed a little bit, but hopefully not. I mean, we have it very close to being done. She's just dotting every I and crossing every T. So hopefully it will be out soon, but I don't want to make a complete promise there because of the fact that, like I said, we got sort of a left hook here and we were not expecting. So we'll move on from there. That's the same one. Yes, another Hollow World, please. Maybe two. Ooh, someone liked Hollow World. Now, I've never understood whether Hollow World was not a huge seller because of the fact that there's only one book. And usually, in order for a book to really sell a lot, having more than one book helps because, it kind of like drags all the other books up and keeps interest in it and keeps it going. Hollow World being a one standalone book and kind of off my normal genre, it was fighting an uphill battle. But I don't know, lately I've actually noticed something of an uptick of people reading Hollow World, which is weird. That was not a book that I really thought would do well because it was much more controversial in a sense that I wrote it as sort of a Rorschach test to see how people would interpret it. and I've had a number of people when it was first published that came back, and some people said this is this or this is that. And it's weird because they actually would present the opposites of what they thought. People would interpret it in totally polarized opposites. And it was generally what people thought. And to give you an idea, for those who haven't read it, it's a view of the future. And some people see it as a utopia and some people see it as a dystopia. And they often see it for completely different reasons. People will look at it as a utopia for different reasons, and other people think it as a dystopia for different reasons. Some people say, my God, I would love to live in that future. Other people would say that is a hellish landscape. We never want to go there. It's just fascinating to see why, because I get emails about it, and I've seen some reviews, and it's just really interesting how some people, because they see what in the book oftentimes what they're looking for, because a lot of it's already there, but other stuff they bring into themselves. So I've always found it fascinating to find out how people interpret it. And it's interesting because there's one character that is neither male or female, but everyone, when you read that book, when you talk to them, they'll pick one. And it's fascinating to see which one they pick. It was rather difficult to write it because I had to write it without any pronouns. And I always find it fascinating when you talk to someone, instantly they will pick one, and it is not always the same. I mean, quite frequently it's different, which is great because I did want it to not have one or the other. So that was a fascinating one to write, and it was kind of cool that, and in some places actually I found out people have asked permission to teach it in universities. So that was kind of cool. Never thought that would ever happen, but there you go. Do you ever catch yourself using your character's profanity by Mar Tetlinowitz? Do you ever catch yourself using? No, I actually have never used those personally. Although I did think of getting a t-shirt that should say by Mar on it. And Tet was just a great way to use it. I really should use it. That would be really good. No one would have any idea what I'm talking about because most of the people I know have no idea who I am or what I write. So if I were to use that in public, people would think I was insane. So if I said by Mara, they'd be like, excuse me? So no, never actually have ever used those things, but have you? Has anyone out there who's read my books ever actually used my profanity? It's weird because I didn't want to use profanity in the books because of the fact that the harsher profanities that we have in real life never really translated for me. They just seemed so out of place and just didn't make any sense. It wasn't that I didn't like profanity. In fact, Hollow World in the mainstream version of that does have a lot of profanity in it because that's what those people would say in those instances. But I just couldn't picture the people in Ryer ever using modern colloquial profanity. It just wouldn't make sense. So I kind of relied on the old school kind of English profanity. And of course, as I went back in time, I realized I actually studied profanity, which is kind of interesting. I was reading up on it and discovered that what we understand as profanity today is nothing like what it would have been in even medieval time, much less going back to, say, the Greek period. That really back then, swearing against the gods was the worst thing you could say. And basically what we would say today as sort of toilet humor or toilet profanity was not an issue. I mean, the words existed, but they were not considered profane. They were considered common. And you could use most of them and no one would even notice that they were a problem. But if you were to swear by a god's body part, that was terrible. In fact, I think it was Queen Elizabeth who like freaked everyone out in her court by saying something like by the eyes of somebody or by God or something. And it totally took them by surprise because that was like one of the worst things anyone could say. Here a woman was saying it. So these are just weird things that you never really thought of as far as how profanity came to be used. And I always thought it was kind of interesting. So I actually went with Tetlin Witch as a form of profanity because that is a curse of an actual person. And of course, by Mar, same thing, by Maribor. So that's another issue where you get the same kind of thing going on. Sometimes I just try to put in a bit of realism, and I don't think anyone has any clue sometimes. I mean, I drop little tiny things in that one would probably think I made up. It's funny, the things I make up, people think I are real, and the things that I are real, they think I made up, which is really kind of strange. I mean, I actually get into research on how to dye wool, or how the wheel was probably invented, or all sorts of little details of painting, or how sailing ships run. Spend a lot of time researching that so that I do get it kind of right, so that when you're reading it, you actually might learn something without even knowing it. I don't know if other people do that. I suppose they probably do. I mean, it's easier. I mean, it's easier to find out how things were done and then be related. The danger, of course, is if you learn too much, you start putting all of that in and it gets boring. So you have to kind of trim it back. But no, in reality, I've never actually used those terms as actual profanity. Notice that in Age of Myth, the art seemed like traditional magic or wizardry. Notice in Age of Myth that the art seemed without much explanation or details about how the magic system worked. Whereas in Age of Swords, the art was described a lot more in depth and became what I considered a very beautiful, unique system. Did you already have the behind-the-scenes details of the art in your mind when you wrote Age of Myth and chose to leave it in more opaque, or that book? Okay. Actually, the entire system was pretty much detailed with Arista in the Revelations. But I never really, I mean, if you know from that book, when magic kind of starts appearing in those stories, there's a certain method that is used to fundamentally create it. And it was that time I was trying to feel my way on how I wanted to have magic work. And I started relating it to sound and music, and that led me to creativity, and that led me to other things. So, but all that was kind of foreign back then. So when I went back to Age of Myth, I already had most of that blocked out. I didn't want to, I was using the same concept with Legends as I did with R'yr, which is that the first book was intended to be very weak, and very, not so much weak, but simple. Theft of Swords, and more accurately, The Crown Conspiracy, is a very, very simple story. There is nothing complicated in there. It's just an introduction to the world and the characters, the main characters, not even many characters, just a couple of them. When you go to Age of Myth, same kind of deal. I'm just trying to give you the most easily understood introduction into the world, and I'm trying to introduce you to a handful of the characters. As you know, when you get to Age of Swords and Age of War, there's a lot of characters in the story that are very lightly mentioned, but you don't get to see much of them until later stories. I didn't want to overwhelm the reader. One of the worst things I found is that if you're introduced to like 10 characters in one scene, it's overwhelming. You don't remember anything that you read or hear, for that matter, during that period. You're just like, I hope that at some future point the author goes through the explanation of who these people are again, because I'm not taking this all in. So the idea was, I tried to make that a simple story to get you in. Because one of the techniques I try to do when I write is if you picture the cover of a book as a door, you open the door up and you start to walk into this world, and you have no idea anything about this world. You have no idea if it's going to be fun, if you're going to like it, if it's going to be real pain, if it's going to require an enormous amount of work before you get anything good. And I found that a lot of fantasy is that way, that it's like this big bramble bush that you have to fight your way through before you even get a peek at what might be worthwhile in the story. And for me, I've always disliked that about fantasy. A lot of times you get into the story and you're like, oh, wow, yes, it was great. I love this story now. Why couldn't it have started out that way? Why did I have to go through all this dry unpleasantry to get to the fun part? So I try to make it so that when you open that door, when you step in, instead of having to climb your way up this mountain full of thorns, I make it so you open the door and you literally fall in. And then you have trouble getting back out, because the story should suck you in. So with Age of Myth, I tried to do that. I tried to make it so I had a lot to tell you, because it was a whole different world from anything that anyone else had, any of my other stuff. Yes, there were certain things that were consistent between the two, but they were very, very different. So I tried to make it so that it was easy to understand, that when you started in, I started with very few characters, the minimum I could do for the scene. And then I very quickly resolved that scene, so you were down to 2 characters, so you can hear their conversation. And at some point, it should start becoming fun. It should start becoming interesting, and then become intriguing rather rapidly before really that first chapter ends. And that's usually always my technique, is I always try to make it so that before the first scene ends or before the first chapter ends, you're interested and you understand. Clarity to me is incredibly important. I need it so that the reader can immediately understand what's happening. I don't want you to wonder or be confused. I don't want to start off not using names of people or clarity of place or what the problem is. I want to tell you right up front, this is the person, this is what they're doing, this is the problem they're having, and this is why they're having that problem. And this is what they're trying to do to fix the problem. And now we're going to move on from there. And once you get that information, it's a lot easier to decide whether you like the story or not, where you think you like where it's going. Also, I try to make sure that what I put in the beginning of the book is representative of where the book's going to go in the long run. If you read the now new opening of Theft of Swords, new opening of Crown Conspiracy, now put in Theft of Swords, you'll notice that in that very first scene that it's sort of a microcosm of the entire series. Almost everything that happens in the entire series is sort of representative in that scene. There's a surprise, there's a revelation, there's a bit of mystery, there's the attitude, there's the banter. You have all of that coming together in that very first scene. So if you like that first scene, odds are you're not going to be disappointed in the rest of the book. And that's kind of the worst thing I think you could do, is if you write something in the beginning of a book that is not representative of the rest of the story, then as the reader, if they like that, and they would because they're continuing to read, so they like that, so they're continuing to read thinking there's going to be more of that, and then that's not what happens, and then they get tired and dull and like, well, this isn't what I thought it was going to be, and they stop reading. Or they just dislike it and they give you a bad review on it. So I try not to do that. I try to give you, the whole concept in there. So that's why I have a tendency to actually write weaker books at the beginning, because I want to get you in. They have to be simple. They have to be easy for you to read. The characters don't have the full depth that you're going to get later on in the story, because I don't want to overwhelm you too much. I want to give you the story and the characters and then let that build. I'm sure I digress there, but let's hope I answered your question. What is your favorite fantasy novel or series that was not written by you? Oh, I like that. And what do you love about it? Okay, so favorite fantasy novel. Well, the only one I could really bring up would be obviously the book that got me reading in the first place and kind of changed my life, which would be Tolkien. The Hobbit. This is a book that when I was very young, I was probably 4 or 5, and I was sharing a bedroom with my brother, and he woke me up in the middle of the night. And I can imagine this is a summer's night, windows are open, crickets are outside creaking. I'm a little kid. He wakes me up in the dark of the night, has a flashlight, comes over to me and says, I've got to tell you something that's very important. And he begins to tell me the story of Bilbo Baggins and how he meets Gollum, because he just got done reading it. It was all exciting. He wanted to tell someone, so the only person he could tell was his little brother. So he told me the story of Gollum, and he told me the story of Bilbo, and he told me the story of the elves, and he told me the story of the wizard Gandalf and all this stuff. And he also drew pictures. He drew pictures of the maps. He drew pictures that were illustrated on the cover. He did a full-scale image of what used to be I can't reach them now where I'd show it to you. I have them up here in my original paperbacks that were done by Valentine. There's beautiful illustrations on the covers of them. And they're very weird and very unusual. And he put these all over my wall and the bedroom. And they were just these massive maps and weird symbols and runic of Elvish. And I thought, growing up, I just saw these things. And then my father died and we moved. And we moved to another house and those all went away. And years went by. And I was now 13. And I was walking past the books, just a bookcase in our living room. And I saw The Hobbit. And I hadn't seen that book ever. But the image was the image that had been on my walls as a child. And I'd forgotten all about it until I saw it. And I couldn't figure out what that was. It was just like, it was almost like, close to cards, the third comment. This means something. I don't know what it means. I was remembering these childhood memories, had no clue what it was because I'd completely forgotten about it. But I took it down, and that was the first book. I mean, I had been trying to read books, like Boy and His Dog books, and they put me to sleep. I didn't care about them. But I picked up this book, and I just like, there's something weird secret about this book. I couldn't figure out what it was. And I started reading it. And as I got into the story, I started remembering names. There was the name Gandalf and there was the name Bilbo. I'm like, I know these names. How do I know these names? And it was just this huge mystery. And then finally, when I got to the 5th chapter and I got to the Gollum scene, I'm like, oh, that's what this is. And I was just, it was less a book and more part of who I was, even from the time I started reading. So that had this extra emphasis into it. So it was this magical thing from the very first word. And I really enjoyed how he pulled you in. I liked your writing. I liked the story. And then I went on and read all of them. And so that was clearly important to me from that point of view. But also, when I got done with it, I couldn't find another book anywhere near as good. So I started writing my own. So when I got to high school shortly thereafter, in order to make friends in this new world that I was in, because we had moved and I didn't have any friends there, I started using the books as kind of ways to get people to like me. It's like, well, have you read this? And they would like it. And then we could talk about it. And then I would make friends that way. So Tolkien, in a way, gave me my first friends. He gave me what later on became a favorite hobby, which was writing. And then later on after that, because I actually ended up meeting my wife through a Dungeons and Dragons game, which I was playing because I had been reading Tolkien. He kind of introduced me to my wife and now gave me an entire career in writing. So as a result, and I also read the books to my children as they got, older enough to be able to understand. So that book was kind of like fundamentally changing my life. So it gets a little bit of extra oomph when you're talking about what is my favorite book. So that would be it. Let's see. But just to get, I noticed part of the question there I didn't necessarily answer was what do I like about it? Obviously, a lot of that. But when I was starting to write Revelations, what I wanted to do was write the kind of book I always wanted to read. So I had to ask myself, what kind of book did I want to read? So I started thinking about all the books that I liked the best and what they had in common in order to give my sense of self, sense of how I wanted to form it. And I noticed that almost all of them had characters in them that I thought were people I would actually like to know. I would actually like to have these people as my friends. That was one of them. The other feature was they took place in an environment that if I had the opportunity, I would actually like to visit. And even more so, maybe I'd even like to live there. So it was a pleasant place that was wonderful, that had all kinds of cool stuff in it that I wanted to live in. And like I said, people who I really want to spend a lot of time with because I wish they were friends. And it had a fairly quick movie plot. Those were the three things that I took. And so when I was making Revelations, those were the three things that I was trying to keep in the back of my mind that I wanted to put in my book. There's very few books that do that. Lord of the Rings did it. Harry Potter series did it. Those were and Watership Down did it. Those were probably the three major fantasy books that I actually found those consistent elements in it. And those were the books that I really was excited to read over the course of my life. So that should probably hopefully answer that question more elaborately now. I find your background research reading intriguing. On your blog, we know you are reading on birds at the moment, but ever considered mentioning your research reading on the blog as well? No, actually I haven't, because I would think it'd be quite boring. It isn't like I'm delving into stuff. I read portions of different things. Like I said, I read a very small book on profanity, on the history of profanity. I actually have a couple of Encyclopedia Britannicas, which I flip through from time to time just to come up with things. But usually it's a result of something I don't know that I'm going to be using extensively. A good example would be Emerald Storm. When I got to writing Emerald Storm, I knew it was going to be set on a sea, sailing vessel, which of course is completely wrong, given medieval times didn't have that sort of a sailing vessel. But hey, it's a fantasy book. I don't know anything about sailing. At least I didn't. So how was I going to learn how to write about it convincingly? One of the things I did was I checked out books from libraries. I went to some of the libraries actually were selling books because they have these book fairs where they just sell books really cheaply. And I managed to nail a couple of really good books. One was a very thick hardcover called The Age of Nelson, and the other one was The Age of Sail. And in these books, they're like textbooks. They explain all the terms and methods and how the books or how the ships worked and how they were built and so on and so forth, which was great from a very technical sense. But it really didn't give me any kind of sense of how best to bring that to life. How would sailors actually have spoken? How would they have given orders? How would those orders have been relayed necessarily? The very specific details. And so what I did was I actually picked up C.S. Forester's Horatio Hornblower series, because what I had heard was that he was very knowledgeable about sailing and his books were very, very accurate. So I went, oh, great. So I read those for color, for flavor, for feel. And I combined that with the research that I did for the novel, for background information. So I would read something in C.S. Forester's books and I would go compare them to the textbooks and go, oh, now I know exactly what that means. And once I learned all that stuff, I like dumped all of it into Emerald Storm and then realized that I was starting to write a nonfiction book on sailing. So I had to rip a lot of that out and sort of keep enough of the flavor, make it seem real, but not overwhelm the plot. I mean, when I was writing Age of Legends books, I read up on Iron Age and Stone Age and Greek myth and those kinds of things, just to give myself a sense of. I mean, I read books about the Aryan races as they traveled from India all the way across Europe up into the Germanic tribes area, and then how they got over to. I mean, so when I say Aryan, I mean it's like the language, Ayran. So there's these large groups of people in mass migration and how they moved and how they became part of the tribes that later threatened Rome and so on and so forth. So a lot of that I put into it, and a lot of that gives me research, and that's how I found out about round houses, and then there was long houses and those kinds of things, which I put into the book. And how they would deal with not having money, and how they would do trading, and how they had way houses on the roads rather than taverns and cities, and so all those things I used to sprinkle into the story. But it wasn't really. I mean, it was kind of a haphazard thing. I would read a little bit here, a little bit there. It wasn't like I was doing very precision or strict studying on this book and then moving to that book. I have a tendency to read a lot of history just as a means of, because it's a great source of information for A, writing fantasy, and B, I just find it interesting to begin with. So no, I never actually thought of putting that on my blog. I don't actually think of putting a lot of stuff like that on my blog. I guess maybe I should. Robin would love it if I would write more extensive essays about things, and maybe I will. A lot of people actually have given me a rather strong positive feedback to the bird post that I put up as sort of a lark. One is still coming. It's been done for a long time, but like I said, we ran into issues that Robin was holding that off in order to put it up, I think, after the Kickstarter, and she just has not gotten around to it. So you have yet to see the final aspect of that series of posts. Oh yeah. What's the coolest bird you have seen recently? Well, the coolest bird, a couple of the coolest birds I've seen was the magnificent frigate bird, it's a cool looking bird, but also I love the name. Also the purple gallinule, which is a really colorful bird, which I saw down in the Everglades. But most recently, the book that, or the bird that here, I'll show you. This is actually something I can show you here. So this is my bird journal. So in here we have the different birds that I've seen. Some of them are, I don't know if I can line it up here, but these are photographs that I took, and these are the birds and when I saw them and what number I got. So the last book, or the last bird listed here is the chirping sparrow, and it's 101. So I'm up to 101 now. Although my daughter is rapidly catching up, and she's I think she noticed that she's at now 79. So tough challenge there. Let's see. Moving on for young birds. For an aspiring author who is interested in becoming traditionally published, would you say that writing a somewhat simpler story as a first entry to a series or simplifying a more complex one is something that potential agents would want? honestly, I think that most potential agents would be just really happy with a good book. And when I say good book, I mean, obviously, what does that mean? Um, when I see, I've had a lot of people give me, a lot of aspiring authors have come here. A lot of aspiring authors have sent me their opening pages to their books, and they're almost all very consistent. There's almost, you can, I can pretty much read the first 5 pages of a book and tell you at what stage that writer's at, because I went through them myself, and I know now that I've seen this over and over again. Everyone goes through the same process. Um, what they're looking for is a story that shows a not just competence in the craft, but at least that, but hopefully a bit of talent in the craft area, but also a certain degree of skill or ability in the storytelling as well. Those are usually not necessarily the same things. And there are many people who are really good at the craft. And when I mean the craft, I mean like writing sentences, writing prose, writing characterization and setting and paragraphs and delivering it in a certain clear way, with not repeating words and not using all long sentences or all short sentences, or not understanding the concept between dialogue and internal thought and narrative being the 3 components you use to establish plot, setting, and character. These are all things that you should know in order to write. Those are the things that they're going to see first and say, oh, okay, you don't have the basics down. But once you've got those basics down, then the next thing they're looking for is that spark, that part that no one can really teach you. It's the creativity part. It's the part of knowing what word comes next, what happens in the plot, what makes this character unusual from any other character they've ever read. And for the most part, I think agents have a tendency to be a bit jaded, just as any reviewer of a movie would be, because they read a lot. They read dozens and dozens of these stories. They know exactly how it's going to go. They are looking for something different, which is why usually, oftentimes, highly acclaimed books for the average reader don't seem necessarily all that good, because to them, they're kind of weird or hard to read sometimes. But for the critical reader, it's great because it's different. But for a person who doesn't have that background and doesn't know about all those stories, for them, for example, someone who read Harry Potter would have no idea that she stole a lot of the ideas from previous writers, because they never read them. They were children. So why would they even notice? And the other thing is that even if you do borrow ideas from previous writers, it doesn't matter if you do it really, really well. Execution is huge. And execution is not just craft. Execution is both craft and how you think. Because literally when you write, writing is just thinking basically in words on a page or on a screen. So these are things that if you think in a way that when you approach an idea, you approach it differently or with some sort of unusual insight or from an unusual angle, and you make people go, I never thought of it that way before. This is interesting. Then you'll probably be able to be a good writer. And that's what they're looking for. They're looking for that thing that makes them go, oh, well, this is, first of all, it's written well, it's written in a class of skill that is at least competent, but also they've intrigued me. This is a fascinating idea. Even if it's an old idea, even if it's something they've seen before, if it's done in an unusual, compelling way, they're going to be interested in, and because they're a reader, and you want to hook them like any other reader. Just because they're Asian doesn't mean anything. You hook them like any other reader. They like the story. They're compelled by it. They'll want more. And if they like it, then they'll put it on the publisher, and then the same thing happens. So hopefully the complexity or the simplicity of the story doesn't matter. Just make sure it's clear, understandable, and is intriguing and compelling to read. And make sure you have, a decent enough skill in it that you aren't doing a lot of dumb mistakes like repeating the same word or using overly verbose verbs in order to try and sound more poetic or things of that nature. Like I said, there's a process that almost everyone goes through when they learn how to write, and they always go through the same mistakes. And finally, if they complete the process, you get someone who can write well. It doesn't necessarily mean they can make good stories, but at least they can write well. You read my mind with the Emerald Storm detail about sailings. Would you ever consider a different series using some of the sailing knowledge? Perhaps something piratey in the golden age of sail. The golden age of sail. No, because I'm actually not all that comfortable with my knowledge of sail. I mean, like I said, that's arbitrary that I picked off and tried to use illusion to make you think I know what I'm talking about. I really don't. If I was a sailor, if I knew about sailing, if I could have some kind of firsthand experience, then yeah, I would do it. But as it is, that was smoke and mirrors that I put out for the purpose of, because I wanted to have each of the Radio Revelations books take place in a completely different sort of setting. So a sailing boat I thought was a great way to do that. So I was really intrigued by that, but I don't really feel all that comfortable doing that. I'm sure I would make tons of mistakes, and I don't like making mistakes that much, even though it's my world and whatever I say is going to be, what is. Nevertheless, I do try to make it seem as realistic as I can. And I know there's a lot of people out there who are sailors who would read Emerald Storm and say, you got this completely wrong. And then there's other people out there who would have no idea. But usually the person in the middle is the one I'm aiming for anyway, the one who has some basic knowledge and think maybe I got it kind of good. And that's good enough for me. Oh, someone's enjoying the bird post. I'm going to jump over to chat, see if anyone's chatting over there about anything I should know about. Didn't notice that actually. In my case, I loved your characters and stories, but also loved Sanderson's unique words. Unique words. Okay. I'm not sure what that was in reference to. I hope she is okay. Yes, I hope so too. I had never heard of Hollow World. Ooh, jumped. I had never heard of Hollow World actually, but now I would be interested in trying it. Oh, great. I sold you on it. Be warned, it's not like my other stuff, and yet it is. I mean, my style or my voice, if you call it, it does permeate through all my stuff. It tends to differ a little bit in tone and certainly in topic, but I mean, if you like my other stuff, you probably would enjoy the basic story of it. Let's see. So it was like an entry point for readers. Yes. All of my first books are very intentionally, the first book is always very intentionally. In the first sentence and the first paragraph, I work very hard at. Usually I'll finish the book and then I'll go back and I'll work on the first paragraph and then I'll work on the first sentence over and over. I remember opening of Wintertide, the opening where we talk about Mintz trying to steal the purse. That first sentence was worked over and over and over and over until I finally got it to where I felt it was right. And that was a tough one because the first sentence needs to be compelling, interesting, well-written, and have something extra that once you read that first sentence, you're compelled to read the second one, or certainly finish that paragraph. And like I said, when you open that door, you want to fall in. I want to make it easy for you to get interested in it. And now a lot of that depends on the first sentence, which is why I tend to really harp on that when I get new writers who send me their first 5 pages. I mean, that first sentence should be fantastic. And then the first paragraph should be really good. And by the time I get to the end of the 5 pages, I should want to read more. And when that doesn't happen, then I know that they don't realize the importance of those first 5 pages. So oftentimes people use the first 5 pages to set a mood or to do a prologue in which they never name anyone. They say things like, he was in darkness and reached out and sensed evil. And you get done, you're like, I have no idea who's doing what, when, where, and I don't really care. So it's kind of important to me that if you give them a lot of information in a very distilled, simple form, it's easier to grab someone's imagination and keep them riveted. Like one of I once told my wife, I said, well, you need to be able to tell them who the person is, where they are, what they're trying to do, what the problem is. And I said, if you could do that one sentence, that would be great. She says, well, you can't do that in one sentence. I said, actually, you can. And I literally ripped off a sentence off the top of my head, which is, if I can remember correctly, was Officer Jane Hathaway didn't know whether she should cut the red wire or the blue wire, but she knew she had 5 seconds to decide. You have all the information there that you need, and yet it's very simple. It's not even a very long sentence, but You know the sex of the person, you know probably what they do for a living, you know pretty much what the situation is, you know what the problem is, and you know that there's a time limit. So all of that is in one freaking sentence, and it's the first sentence, and then you can build off of that from that point. I don't generally go to that much extreme because I'm trying to do something maybe a little different with each book, but that's just a good example of how you can go about being clear, and then immediately the reader is going to be like, oh, I know what's going on here. Oh, I'm intrigued. I want to find out how this turns out. So that's always something to think about when you're writing. Let's see. Where did we leave off? Entry point for readers. That makes sense. That's a pretty cool story. Again, I don't have no idea what to reference to now. I made it back before the end. Haha. Well, welcome back. So will there be a full recording of the Steam posted somewhere? Of the Steam? I don't understand what that means. Of the Steam posted somewhere afterwards. Oh, of the stream. I gotcha. Of this. Yes, I believe there is. There was last time. So I suspect there will be this time. Let's see here. I don't think you want to run this in reruns, do you? That would be boring. Not that entertaining. Will there be a full recording? Yes. Okay. Fantasy birding. Interesting. I'm not sure what that's in reference to, but I'm now intrigued because there's a link with it. Those were some very effective smoke and mirrors. Yes, I do that a lot. Unique worlds, not words. Sorry. Yes, I do a lot of smoke and mirrors sometimes, and I've managed to skate by on it. I guess if you trust your author, you probably think they're smarter than what they really are. There was this time when I was on a panel with, I think it's Jack McDermott and Joe Haldeman. They were the older ones, and I was on it, and I think M.K. Jennison was on it. It's kind of the newer authors, and they were talking about the difference between old and new. And I made the comment that, nowadays you can literally write with a great deal more accuracy because you can use Google Earth and drop right down on a road, say anywhere in the world, and you can literally look around and you can describe what's there. And I think it was Joe Haldeman who had made the comment that he knew of an author who wrote about Paris, and people loved his work and they thought it was fantastic. And it turned out that he had never been to Paris, didn't know the first thing about Paris. But Joe said that his interpretation of Paris was so much better than the real Paris that he saw when he went there. So I don't know. There's something to be said about making things up. Let's see. That was in reference to your answer about the focus on characters and story of strange world building. Okay. Was just saying that I love you for the characters and story, but also enjoy the unique stuff in his words. Okay. Oh, well, thank you for saying that I can explain writing in a clear, concise way. Okay, so I'm going to try to remember there's two things I want to bring up here. So we're going to go back to Joshua's comment here. The unique stuff in my world. Yeah, this is just something that I kind of noticed is that when you write, if you just write for the characters and plot, in other words, these people are doing this and that's all that you're talking about, they don't seem real. It's too focused. It's too single-minded. People aren't that way. I always feel that it's important to show what other interests they have, what other thoughts they have. Everyone has thoughts that we have. We have thoughts about what we like, what we don't like, what hobbies we have versus things that other people do that annoy us. We have philosophical conversations with ourselves and other people. We have difference of opinion and all those things which have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the plot. I have a tendency to drop in the book just because that's how people act. And I think not only does that help create their characters and give them more depth, but it also, I think, fills out the plot to some degree. Doesn't really do anything really toward getting them to their goal necessarily, but you get to know them better. And I think that brings them and makes them more alive. It makes them less like vehicles to carry the reader through the story, and much more along the lines of these are real people that you're witnessing. And when they become real people to you, then you want to read about them all the more. I mean, people have been fascinated by like characters like Sherlock Holmes for hundreds of years, and people who didn't create him are now writing stories about that character. There's many characters of that nature. Once you fall in love with the character, you want to read more and more. So if you were writing a story as an aspiring writer, one of the things I would suggest is focusing on making kind of a compelling character that people want to read. Now, a lot of people want to write stories that are about unlikable characters or anti-heroes and that kind of thing. And you can sometimes make that work, but it's harder. If you can create a character that people are finding intriguing or whom they like. I mean, like Sherlock Holmes is a good example because he's not really all that likable of a character, and yet he is, in a sense that he's so intriguing and fascinating, and he's made to be more